Okay, so welcome everybody. Hopefully everyone online can hear me. I'm looking at the chat, so if you can't, just let me know. Well, I guess you'll know to let me know if you can't hear me. I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to, thank you, G, to this Shame in Medical History seminar as part of our ongoing seminar series, which is a collaboration with the Center for Medical History and the Shame in Medicine project, which is based here in the Wellcome Center for Cultures and Environments of Health. And this is our second seminar as part of this series. And I'm really delighted to welcome my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Fred Cooper, to speak today, Loneliness and Shame Towards a Historical Genealogy. Fred is a contemporary historian of medicine and a transdisciplinary researcher, and he identifies himself as a medical humanities scholar, broadly speaking. His primary interests are shame and loneliness and their histories, and also as thinking about them as objects of analysis and several other things. But I've recently collaborated with Fred and also Arthur Rose on a research project about shame, stigma, and COVID, and we co-authored a book together, which I mention here because it came out about a month ago. It's called COVID-19 and Shame.
It's on one of the slides.
Oh, and it's on one of the slides, so it's more on that. So thank you, Fred, for agreeing to speak, and I'm sure we're all really looking forward to what already sounds like a very interesting talk. So I'll hand it over to you, and I'll keep an eye on the chat if anyone has any comments.
Cool, thank you, Lila, and thanks everyone so much here and online for coming. Apologies about the title, which is incredibly vague, I think, because I didn't really know what I was going to say at the time, so I just kind of left it open. But what I want to do today is to kind of assert a problem, which I'm by no means the first person to do. In brief, that loneliness is a shamed experience, which carries complex connotations of individual defects and failure. And then go in search of some, but by no means all, of the historical processes which I think have contributed to this. I then want to reflect a little, really quite briefly actually, on how a deeper understanding of how shame works might help us rethink the ways we approach chronic or intractable loneliness. So I'm going to start in the archives of Philanthropic Society, the Women's Group on Public Welfare, which I'll say is WGPW after this, who compiled a report on loneliness in the mid-1950s, which was published in 1957 by the National Council of Social Service. The report itself is a rich historical artifact of understandings of loneliness in post-war Britain, but the archive of the WGPW offers a huge amount of context, and not least because the group invited a series of psychiatrists, psychologists, academics, doctors, social workers, and housing officers to talk to them about loneliness, and then minuted what they said. So these expert testimonies addressed a number of different causes and contexts for loneliness, many of them very familiar in present-day loneliness research. Of these, I'm going to dwell in particular on the problem of personality. So the first speaker invited by the WGPW was the medical director of the Roffey Park Rehabilitation Centre, TM Ling. In his talk, Ling identified loneliness as the chief problem of the mid-20th century. Although he implicated a number of largely nostalgic social and cultural factors, such as a supposed decline in neighbourliness and religious observance, he argued that efforts to mitigate loneliness through initiatives such as community centres and social clubs were frequently frustrated by the very people they targeted. As he put it, often the lonely person was the difficult person, their very way of life contributing to the fact that they did not fit in easily with other people. A second speaker, the self-help author Peggy Makins, who wrote as Evelyn Home, framed the point in less tactful terms. And I quote, "As we're trying to get to the roots of this problem, it should be made clear from the outset that the lonely person is fundamentally very unlovable. Loneliness is solitude thrust upon us, and solitude is not thrust upon any lovable person." So these few sentences stayed with me quite a long time, actually, before I started working explicitly on shame. So they seem to crystallize something crucial about the relationship between loneliness and shame, something which, although I think is asserted quite frequently, remains under-theorised and has even more rarely been subject to historical attention and care. So researchers in a number of disciplines are fairly comfortable, I think, with the truism that loneliness can be a source of shame for people who experience it, and that this is in part a product of negative social, medical, cultural, and political valuations of loneliness, which dovetail into neoliberal and, of course, older logics of individual responsibility for relationships and health. People who experience loneliness are frequently made to feel ashamed, as structural causative stories, such as the cost of living crisis, the impact of austerity policies, or the longer and deeper unravelling of the welfare state, are elided in favour of a shaming language of social ineptness and personal failure. As the cultural and social geographer Eleanor Wilkinson recently put it, contemporary constructions often position loneliness as something shameful and potentially pathological. Loneliness is framed as an individual failure or a failure of community rather than a structural condition. While loneliness is now understood as widespread, there is still a sense that one should not admit to feeling lonely, as to be lonely is to have failed. Indeed, participating in a recent study with the Co-op Foundation, one young person suggested that to be seen as lonely is to be seen as though there's something wrong with you. 81% of the young people in the study also cited fear of other people's reactions as a barrier to speaking about loneliness. This evidence mirrored earlier research with young people taken by the same organisation, in which participants expressed the fear that if they were to...
Sorry, Fred, there's someone hard of hearing. Could you just turn your camera on so they can see your mouth?
Oh, okie dokie. Yeah, let's see. Come on.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, sure. Sorry. Where's the kind of, oh, here we go. Start video. I don't know how useful it will be because I'm going to be turning to the room as well.
Just
but,
can you slide it to the forward and you can pin it, I think, for...
Oh, yeah.
So we can see you better.
Of course. If I
Very good.
kind of put
Yes.
it like...
That's visible.
Is that better? All right. I'll just hide the self-view so I can't. Yeah, so participants expressed the fear that if they were come forward to seek help for their feelings of loneliness, they would simply be told to pull themselves together. So without entertaining what I think is a kind of useless assumption that loneliness is like intrinsically shaming, it can be difficult for us not to interpret the presence, absence, or health of our relationships as signifiers of individual worth. So in his 2021 book, Alone, for example, the German essayist Daniel Schreiber described in his words, the belief that I could not really be loved was not in any real sense lovable. Reading Schreiber's words alongside Evelyn Holmes, it's hard to ignore a historical and ongoing tension in how we address questions over lovability, which I subsume in this paper into wider debates on personality, individual responsibility for loneliness, and shame. Recent literatures on loneliness and stigma leave these tensions largely unresolved, in part through an otherwise laudable attempt to avoid reproducing stereotypes and narratives which might heighten the burden of shame. So thus, in a recent article, did that change? A recent article written by an interdisciplinary team in psychology, education, communication, and public health, led by my colleague at the Wellcome Centre, Manuela Barreto, we have extensive quantitative analysis of global responses on loneliness and stigma, dissected along lines of gender, age, and culture, but not much articulation beyond a brief note in the literature review of what precisely the culturally shared beliefs are, which colour representations and experiences of loneliness, and heighten or perpetuate complex systems of stigma and shame. Although past research had demonstrated that people who feel lonely are, in the words of the authors, perceived to be socially inept, poorly adjusted, unlikable, and generally incompetent, such assumptions, they stress, have been rigorously debunked. Far less clear, both here and elsewhere, is where these languages actually come from, how shame has accrued or been assembled around loneliness as an emotion or experience, and how this has changed over time, including during more recent and not always unproblematic attempts at destigmatisation. What is needed, and what this paper goes some fractional way towards, are histories of the lonely person as not good enough, as difficult, compromised, unlovable, and morally flawed. So Manuela and her co-authors rightly argue that we need to examine other ways beyond loose cultural perceptions in which stigma around loneliness can be endorsed and expressed. Indeed, scholarship in the medical humanities and social sciences has demonstrated a number of contexts in which shame and stigma have been knowingly or unwittingly produced by discourses and interventions on health. Perhaps most notably in the recent work of Alexandra Burris and Amber Wujcik, but also just to get the plug in my recent book with Duna Dolezal and Arthur Rose. And lots of other places as well. This body of research, I suggest, can offer a useful conceptual framework for understanding one particular way that loneliness has been invested with shame. In the deliberate acts of naming, definition, and description increasingly undertaken from a plethora of expert and pseudo-expert perspectives over the course of the 20th century. This is not, of course, to minimize the importance and reach of everyday cultural perceptions. The shared and fluid life and meaning that ideas have shapes not just how we consciously articulate our feelings and experiences, but how we actively live and inhabit them. The experiences of illness and low mood are framed by how they're publicly and expertly represented and discussed is by now quite an old assertion. Well-known work by the historian Matthew Thompson has shown how across the 20th century, psychological concepts and language have become increasingly central both to our self-fashioning and how we understand the world around us, including our relationships and interactions with others. There is, in brief, no basis for disentangling what we might term real experiences of shame over loneliness from past and present discourses on who becomes lonely, how and why. In part, we can read mid-century attributions of loneliness to flawed personalities in the context of interwar work such as the psychoanalyst Karen Horney's 1937 book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. I think what is important to recognize is the extent to which the Anglophone study of loneliness emerged through and alongside these questions and concerns. So often considered a foundational text, Gregory Zilberg's 1938 essay on loneliness for The Atlantic played extensively with themes of hostility and narcissism. Over the following decades, a proliferation of writing on loneliness in print journalism and the social sciences continue to problematize personality as a decisive factor, dwelling on unlovable character traits such as selfishness and self-pity, or difficult and distancing emotions such as anger and resentment. I'm just going to have a drink. Sorry. So the act of uncovering loneliness and tracing its contours was, and still is, an act of construction. This work established powerful cultural and intellectual scripts which continue to haunt recent attempts to reframe and destigmatize loneliness as an experience which doesn't discriminate. My practice as a historian of loneliness sits within a growing field of study, situated broadly across social and cultural history, the history of the emotions, and histories of medicine, humanities, and the social sciences. Alongside the work of historians such as Barbara Taylor, David Vincent, Keith Snell, Hannah Yip, Thomas Clifton, Geoffrey Mathias, and Feybound Alberti, as well as a very recent Routledge handbook edited by Katie Barclay, Deborah Simonton, and Elaine Chalice, with too many authors to mention. My research asserts that loneliness has a rich and vibrant history, and that historical work has vast potential to inform, nuance, and unsettle discussions on loneliness in the present day. Rather than uncovering past experiences of loneliness or historicizing the processes and contexts which made them more likely, my interest is in comprehending and critiquing how, where, when, and why, and also by whom, the idea of loneliness has been assembled around particular kinds of emotion and experience. Historians of loneliness, I suggest, can and should apply the kind of rigorous, critical, politically attentive questioning commonplace in historical analyses of discourses on anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, or stress, and present as well in recent feminist work on loneliness. This kind of historical excavation, in the case of this paper, around the problem of personality, can offer significant insight into questions such as why loneliness is considered shameful, which can otherwise be difficult to understand. I've got a problem in my throat. The shame. So I begin from the point the 20th century writing on loneliness frequently shamed and devalued people who feel lonely. This process of shaming has been subtle, it's been overt, it's been intentional, and it's been accidental. So it ran the gamut from knowingly attributing personal weakness and failure through to a preoccupation with individual determinants, such as specific kinds of personality trait, which position the lonely person as the problem, over and above the context, environments, and institutions which frame healthy relationships, community embeddedness, and feelings of belonging. One intention of this paper is to track between historical sources where shame is a clear consequence of narrative. In other words, which are, you set me off, Tom, which are instantly recognizable as humiliating or scornful, and writing or speech which carries comparable implications, but arrives at them obliquely or with veiled meaning. So to illustrate the former, I'm going to begin with a rare example of what might be termed loneliness denial. A 1929 essay in the Derby Daily Telegraph penned by the journalist and author of adventure novels, Andrew Suter. Taking sight at this dirge about loneliness that he perceived in contemporary culture and society, the essay dismissed, in his words, the lonely men and women sobbing out their hearts in lonely corners, isolated, pariahs, unwanteds, alien to the spirit of friendship, incapable of making friends. Loneliness be hanged, Suter continues. Show me the man or woman who is dying of loneliness, and I will show you a sufferer from the greatest evil that can afflict a race, the evil of self-pity. You can see that Suter is a man who is drunk on the spiciness of his own take. There's something enduring about the kind of agent provocateur kind of, yeah, sorry. So for Suter, loneliness and mental virility were mutually exclusive. An attempted suicide turned on the foolish hope that the pity of others would, in his words, lift them out of the morass into which their own lack of courage has placed them. So self-pity, he argued, degrades those who fall back on it. Nothing is so nauseating to those who are compelled to behold it. The lonely person makes of every friend and acquaintance a leaning post. His lachrymose wailings sap even the physical strength of those who are courageous enough to tackle their own troubles in solitude. He asks not necessarily for money, but for pity. He's mentally lazy. He's unfitted for everything. He's a drone in the hive. He irritates the working bees. It sounds like one of my school reports. Suter's words framed loneliness as an explicit matter of self-indulgence and moral failing, contrasting sufferers with the courageous and productive victims of their lack of emotional discipline. The self-pity inherent in loneliness here is nauseating to those forced to bear witness to it. If not precisely contagious, then simultaneously a source of bodily disgust and an epicenter for social and relational malaise. Though it's impossible to determine the extent to which Suter's readership shared his feelings, other more sympathetic pieces on loneliness across the 20th century prompted deluges of letters from people who identified as lonely. It's plausible then that some of his audience were feeling lonely when they read this and that he could have exacerbated or caused feelings of shame. But while Suter's essay was remarkable in its willingness to shame its subjects, the scripts it relied on found purchase in other contemporary writing, perpetuating tropes which helped to frame loneliness as a shameful marker of spoiled identity. An article on the poverty of loneliness written for the Daily Mail by the poet Edith Sitwell in 1931, for example, contrasted the loneliness brought upon us by no fault of our own with the consequences of being too selfish to gather any human beings near the fires of our heart. As I'll go on to discuss, this dichotomy recurred quite frequently in loneliness taxonomies, imposing a brittle logic of blamelessness and culpability, which allowed for a particular valuation of competing causative stories. Sitwell's entanglement of loneliness with selfishness clearly reverberated with readers of the Sunday Times 31 years later. So responding to a clutch of articles written by the journalist and later well-known children's novelist Susan Cooper, one correspondent noted that it seemed there's one thing wrong with the people who experience loneliness in our big cities, this prevalent habit of expecting to get but omitting to give. A second reader, identifying herself as the organizer of a social club for former psychiatric patients, of all things, wrote that one point which was not made and which I regard as significant is that a great deal of loneliness is rooted in selfishness. Lonely people, she argued, avoided other lonely people because they're terrified that the person approached may, in his or her gratitude, become a nuisance and a burden and make emotional demands. This second perspective represented a reformulation of Souter's caricature of lonely people dragging those around them into a sinkhole of misery and obligation. Where the mentally virile had been justified in maintaining their distance, however, this kind of avoidance on the part of the lonely meant that they had, in the words of the person writing, no right to grouse over their own suffering. Personal responsibility for loneliness, it seems, had become a discursive script that some readers expected journalists to pay lip service to. The uneasy proximity between loneliness and selfishness in these accounts also had traction in more formal systems of knowledge. The Ukrainian-American psychoanalyst Gregory Zilborg, is widely credited with authoring the first substantial psychological article on loneliness in the English language, in the form of an influential and much cited piece for The Atlantic magazine in 1938. In a recurring strand of analysis, Zilborg's essay detailed the type of sheer selfishness called narcissism, in which the individual happens to choose only himself instead of others as the object of love. Loneliness, he argued, was the frequent fate of the true narcissist, whose overwhelming self-involvement precluded their being loved by others. In Zilborg's words, they, the narcissist, would feel themselves lost. They would experience a sense of uselessness. They would become low-spirited, somewhat irritable, and perhaps feel ill-treated by fate, lonely. They would find that nothing satisfied them. A feeling of emptiness would pervade them, and they would appear to cower and to succumb under the burden that is loneliness. I always feel like psychologists were like more fun, like 70, 80 years ago sometimes. Like they really just kind of, there's like a kind of flair. While loneliness often followed narcissism, the direction of travel could be muddy and indistinct. So even in normal loneliness, or what Zilborg termed lonesomeness, which is a kind of linguistic slippage I'm really interested in, but won't get into much here. He wrote that we may on closer inspection discern at the beginning the germ of narcissism, as we are preoccupied with the contemplation of our own misery. Self-pity here was a facet of self-love, rather than a contrary or dissonant experience. As a brief example of how this kind of knowledge is built, we can see Zilborg's hypotheses cited directly in another foundational text, the psychiatrist Frieda Fromm-Reichmann's famous 1959 essay, also titled Loneliness. While Fromm-Reichmann gave less space to narcissism than Zilborg, she rephrased one of his key conclusions relatively uncritically, noting that the, in her words, narcissistic megalomaniac attitude will not be acceptable to the environment, which will respond with hostility and isolation of the narcissistic person. While this reframing shifted emphasis away from the individual and towards a rejecting environment, the process was still articulated as natural and inevitable. Interestingly, Fromm-Reichmann speculated further that the lonely person may be displeasing, if not frightening, to his hearers, who may erect a psychological wall of ostracism and isolation about him as a means of protecting themselves. Again, the emphasis is shifted to the reactions of others, but I think this can still be read as another iteration of Andrew Souter's depiction of the lonely as sources of emotional contamination. So loneliness in these accounts became a cipher to be decoded. It marked the sufferer out, offering insights that they hadn't set out to share. One comment made by a young person to researchers from the Co-op Foundation in the late 2010s is pertinent here. To be seen as lonely is to be seen as though there's something wrong with you. The recurring use of to be seen in this testimony draws focus explicitly to the relationship between loneliness and shame. The emphasis here is on the regard of others. Identifying as lonely is exposing and fraught with danger, not just because loneliness is a culturally devalued and shamed experience, but because it's impossible for the person disclosing to exert full control over how that admission is interpreted and made salient. When narratives on loneliness locate etiological power in personal traits and failings, these forms of knowledge then work backwards on the subject, colouring lived experiences with both active and anticipated shame. This is not to say that mid-century taxonomies of loneliness were unable to take structural factors seriously into account. Indeed, frequently the opposite. The persistence of narratives of individual responsibility around and alongside articulations of collective problems, such as housing, community, poverty, gender roles, and work, however, helped undermine loneliness as a language of political complaint, a lens which I think could have allowed for a decreased burden of shame. This ambivalence can further be seen in attempts to provide exhaustive lists of the reasons why and how people became lonely. So in 1959, for example, the National Union of Townswomen's Guilds, or NUTGA, a former suffragist organisation with an increasing emphasis on citizenship and education, sent out guidance on loneliness in towns to their regional branches. Alongside accounts of migration, urban anonymity, and old age, one subheading was also given over to misfits, one of the pathetic problems of most communities. Noting that in many cases people are not liked because of faults of character, the section described the ill-adjusted, the troublesome, the bores, the gauche, and the not so likeable, most of whom would dearly like to be liked. This alights on an enduring point of tension in loneliness narratives. Even when external causative stories are acknowledged, individual characteristics are difficult for us to extricate, particularly bearing in mind that feeling not so likable is a common dimension to many, if not most, experiences of loneliness. Even when these experiences are wholly explained by contexts far beyond our control, whether on the level of individual circumstances and structural inequalities, or on the deeper philosophical plane of alienation as the default mode of modern or even just human life, what we might term the loneliness of loneliness muddies and obscures our ability to reckon with it as a collective plight. Any narrative which takes likability or lovability seriously as an objective or measurable trait contributes to this muddiness, inviting a potentially shaming interpretation of personal failure when far less individualizing narratives more than suffice. As the philosophers of emotion, Tom Roberts, and Joel Kruger have recently argued, representations of loneliness as revolving around a felt absence of longed for social goods are complicated by experiences of chronic loneliness. What happens, they ask, when the desire for connection seems to fade? This tension can be read, I think, in the empty space around the most of whom would dearly like to be liked. Although, of course, a semblance of disinterest in friendship or help can also be a means of saving face. Post-war writers on loneliness insisted that loneliness had a specific temporal prognosis, becoming increasingly severe and resistant to disruption over time. Friendly overtures, recruitment to community groups, and engagement with services consequently had to be timed before damaging and distorting processes of social insistment, in the language of the Peckham experiment, could take full effect, narrowing the window of intervention to a scant matter of years. Contemporaries identified an enervating kind of social atrophy at work in longer experiences of loneliness. As Susan Cooper put it, a tortured inaction, the penalty for a life which has tightened into a hopeless circle. Frequently, journalistic representations of loneliness turned on the conceit of uncovering hidden suffering, with great outpourings of pent-up loneliness occurring whenever interest or sympathy was shown. The language of recognition and restitution, however, imposed a new narrative arc, offering sufferers the opportunity to dissipate shame by demonstrating their willingness to return, to re-adopt the role of the healthy, connected social citizen. But what about the dissenters, the suspicious, antagonistic, ungrateful, or reluctant to change? For Gregory Zilborg, just as loneliness was intimately related to man's narcissism, so narcissism carried with it more than a seed of malice, of hostility, the nucleus of hostility, hatred, impotent aggression of the lonely and abandoned. Likewise, in their 1959 communication to their branches, Nutger stressed that some of the lonely ones, through sheer loneliness, have become bitter, queer, or arrogant. Particularly in discourses on long and intractable experiences of isolation, lonely people's hostility and their capacity to tolerate seeming flaws in others became an increasingly vexed question. One committee member of the WGPW, for example, identified a refractory core of problem people for whom it is sheer misery to meet strangers. They will only have social life on their own terms. They even shrink from or snub neighbourly advances and will not pay the price in effort and tolerance. These narratives demarcated moral space between the deserving lonely, the victims of external pressures and circumstances, and those whose loneliness could be construed as a problem of their odd, intolerant, unlikable, or recalcitrant nature. So Evelyn Holmes' address to the WGPW here, I hate acronyms, bears returning to at greater length. Her usual mode of communication, agony aunt columns, and the growing genre of self-help imposed a specific perspective on loneliness, emphasizing individual agency and responsibility in health in ways which have been rigorously critiqued as creating fertile ground for shame. For Holmes, the path away from loneliness began with a bit of self-knowledge. As a public dispenser of advice, she was frequently in receipt of letters from readers, many of which outlined their own feelings of loneliness or relational dilemmas. In her address to the WGPW, these testimonies became texts for Holmes to interpret. In admitting their loneliness, a measure of narrative control had already been lost. Reading between the lines of her readers' letters, here was a means for Holmes to create and impart unwilling knowledge about the lonely in what can be read as a shaming and extractive way. So she says, if I get a letter from a woman who says that her family shunned her, I usually find in the letter the germ of why they shun her. And often it's because she's intolerably selective. She likes only a certain type of person. The person she thinks she likes does not exist. Such a tiny person whose whole interest is concentrated on the lonely person. There is no person as small as that. For Holmes, the inherent self-involvement of the lonely precluded their seeing others as anything more than two-dimensional sources of support or relief. They constructed an impossible archetype of the selflessly giving lover, sibling, parent, child, or friend, and refused to put up with anything less. The non-lonely, she contended, are snubbed over and over again by lonely people. A lot of them decide to remain lonely, decide that the things we tell them to do are nonsense. They are not that sort of person. The lonely person writes this sort of letter. I'm desperately lonely. I have not a friend existing. Do not tell me to get in touch with my family, to join a club, do social work, etc., because I abhor hospitals or dirt or doing good. Holmes' imagining of how people became and remained lonely conjured a depoliticized social world where individual decisions to opt in or out were the primary determinants of experience. And a stubborn unwillingness to participate in the pageantry of rescue was clear evidence of the difficult personality that had kept others away in the first place. The snub here was a means of achieving a kind of warped and fleeting significance, of wresting a reaction and with it some form of acknowledgement from the disliked but coveted other. As Holmes put it, someone is, as it were, affected by their presence. Excuse me. Parallel discourses on loneliness, intolerance, and hostility, particularly among older adults, can also be read in the annual reports that medical officers for health, or MOHs, oh God, am I really going to say, I'm not going to say MOHs out loud, delivered on public health activities in London boroughs. Although sometimes more sophisticated, they nevertheless continue to problematise lonely subjects in uncomfortable ways. In the 1950s and 1960s, medical officers for health, public health officials with jurisdiction over relatively sizable areas, drew complicated cyclical relationships between loneliness, neglect, personality deterioration, and dementia, cataloguing the difficulties that loneliness in old age presented to health visitors and domestic help services. Reports, oh, here we go. They're great, by the way. They're all fully searchable on the Wellcome website. There's loads and loads of these things. They're fantastic. They talk about all sorts of stuff. If you're historically healthy minded, then yeah, they're really good. So, sorry. Reports covering two boroughs, Southwark and Leighton, are instructive here. So in the first instance, the medical officer of health for Southwark, ADCS Cameron, wrote in 1959 that loneliness could precipitate a physical and mental decay and disintegration, which leads to the rapid onset of a really senile state, when all self-respect is lost. Old people then become careless about themselves. They neglect their personal appearance and make no attempt to take proper meals, and mentally then soon become hostile and suspicious. A year later, he noted, how often an almoner or a doctor rings us asking for services to an old person, adding she lives alone or she feels so lonely, and yet sometimes the lonely are the most difficult to approach. In Leighton in 1958, Melville Watkins repeated the distinction, which, as above, imposed an unsubtle hierarchy of deservingness and need between, in his words, those who are cut off from their contemporaries through circumstances over which they have little or no control, and those who are lonely by temperament. I feel like so much shame is kind of revolves around the assumption that people have control. You know what I mean? Like I think that's a really interesting way of formulating that. So in the latter case, people who are lonely by temperament, he argued, the greatest difficulty arises, and the most time-consuming cases are those elderly people who, through their eccentricities, either refuse help or obstruct it when it's granted. So the dehumanizing language of obstruction and of people consuming time posed its subjects as burdensome, a strain on vital services, in ways which ran in parallel to shaming post-war discourses on obesity, hypochondria, and time wasting in the NHS. These themes came even more forcefully to the surface in a report written by Watkins' successor as medical officer for health for Leighton, E.W. Wright, on a training course for domestic help in 1963. So this is all from the report. The first session began with group discussion on the question, what do you find most trying in dealing with old people? Which was followed by plenary discussion of this subject with the area medical officer. Some of the subjects emerging included the way old people follow the help about, how they do not understand present day conditions or prices, forgetfulness, suspicion, or general nastiness, perhaps related to jealousy of the home help's health and strength, and a very wide variety of interesting and at times amusing difficulties. After a cup of tea, two members of a local dramatic society acted a comedy sketch of a dialogue between an old lady and a home help, in which discussion points were highlighted as follows. The old lady wants things done in a particular way. She's suspicious of theft. She keeps too much furniture to make cleaning easy. She's unwilling to accept the help of her neighbours. She will not eat what she's not used to and has to be persuaded. Loneliness makes her talk so much it's difficult for the help to get away. And some old people are scroungers and feel they ought to get more than they do. Unfortunately, Wright did not record whether the group role-played any solutions to these dilemmas, or what the helpers present were supposed to take from the session beyond the forewarning that the people in their care could be suspicious, obstinate, particular, or otherwise unpleasant and difficult to manage. So in the narratives on chronic loneliness explored in this paper, the question of how stubborn or hostile sufferers might be restored to some degree of social or relational health revealed a spectrum of approaches. In these approaches, we can see laissez-faire abandonment, a kind of infantilizing paternalism, alongside a liberal preoccupation with acts of individual kindness. So one member of the WGPW, E.J.D. Morrison, suggested that if such people with their eyes open choose loneliness rather than a social life not wholly congenial, well and good, their lives are their own. On the topic of misfits, Nupka noted that while people were usually not liked through their own fault, it is no use trying to absolve ourselves of responsibility on these grounds. They're like a child who has climbed a tree and can move neither up nor down. No use telling the child that he should not have got himself into such a position. For Evelyn Home, the answer lay in a stoic refusal to be deterred or offended, which could eventually draw the sting from the preferred weapon of the lonely, the snub. Home says, "It's the time to sink pride to the lowest level to which it's ever gone. Be snubbed over and over again. The snubs cease to mean anything at all, and soon they cease to render any sort of amusement." In this imagination, the answer to individual failure was individual exceptionalism, with kindness, good citizenship, and charity work counterbalancing the resentment and withdrawal of the chronically lonely. As Susan Cooper put it in 1962, there was a shared responsibility to bring into the circle of humanity those shadows of men and women who have time only for themselves. Where, if anywhere, how are we doing? Where, if anywhere, does this get us? In 2018, Theresa May's Conservative government unveiled its loneliness strategy, a development tied to the headline-grabbing Minister for Loneliness earlier in the same year, which was in reality an addition to the portfolio for the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. At the time, attention rightly turned to the hypocrisy of performing a highly visible concern with loneliness at the same time as overseeing a deeper unravelling of the welfare state and our social and community infrastructure under the guise of austerity. For me, however, the more striking point was that loneliness had become an idea that a government like that could do business with, i.e. more or less completely stripped of its potential to act as a radical language of critique, at least in the broader public sphere. It left us with Evelyn Home's impoverished imagining of loneliness as an experience unmoored from structural problems, political decisions, social changes, and big historical, cultural, and ideological shifts. Despite valiant attempts to the contrary, loneliness has been more or less successfully recast as an apolitical emotion, a development which has, of course, been profoundly political. So shame matters here for two reasons. The cultural scripts explored in this paper have persevered in the stories we tell about loneliness and likability, but also in academic research on loneliness, selfishness, anger, and aggression. Indeed, in their recent article on loneliness and stigma, Manuela Barreto and her collaborators cite a number of studies which worked from the assumption that lonely people really are socially inept. Across the mid to late 20th century, neoliberal logics of individual responsibility have also fed an increasing preoccupation with lifestyle and behaviour in public health, framing an idea of the healthy, well-connected, competitive self, which explicitly excludes and shames feelings of loneliness. In the second instance, attempts at destigmatisation have been an important contributor to narratives on loneliness, which counterintuitively allow shame to go unaddressed. In the 2010s and 2020s, much public discourse on loneliness and shame has demurred from a rigorous confrontation of how the two interrelate, occupying itself instead with the sanitized assertion that loneliness doesn't discriminate. So, originating as a quotation from the Labour MP Jo Cox, which in its full form was young or old, loneliness doesn't discriminate, and which was intended to shift conversations on loneliness away from just being a concern of older adults and to encompass the whole life course. This phrase has become firmly embedded in the lexicon of charities, government strategy, and politicians of all stripes. Wallpapering over the well-evidenced connections between loneliness and a raft of health and social inequalities, the aphorism distills a pernicious kind of bland destigmatization, in which problems which are often directly political matters of exclusion, alienation, and injustice could supposedly happen to anyone, Who knows where it comes from? Everyone gets lonely sometimes. It's okay. While this may seem like an antidote to the explicitly shaming imaginaries which connected loneliness with unlovable personality traits such as selfishness or hostility, it simultaneously undermines the only causative story with the narrative power to disperse feelings of individual failure and shame. In the process, it draws focus away from the systemic forms of shaming which are produced by entrenched inequalities and which frequently result in loneliness and alienation. As Zhao Qi Feng and Thomas Astle Burt have recently put it, these are the short-sighted, inadvertent, reckless, and negligent, and I would also add malicious, decisions made across society, fostering stigma and structural discrimination, racism, sexism, ableism, and classism, that generate social and built environments that make many people with these characteristics feel perpetually isolated and unsafe. What this paper has set out to provoke is a more nuanced engagement with how shame and loneliness interact, at least within a certain set of parameters. There are about 1 million other different ways you could look at this. Destigmatization and sustained attentiveness to shame are not the same. The attitudes and behaviors that historical writers found to be evidence of selfishness, suspicion, hostility, intolerance, and stubbornness, serious personality flaws that made chronic loneliness explicable, might better be understood as reasonable reactions to, for example, condescending and dehumanizing interactions with services, but also potentially as complex mechanisms of shame, anticipated shame, shame avoidance, and attempts to save face. For the phenomenologist Luna Dolezal, long experiences of shame are alienating, isolating, and deeply disturbing, provoking powerful feelings of despair, inferiority, powerlessness, defectiveness, and self-contempt. Shame can also go underground, masking itself in self-hatred, anger, excessive pride, and insecurity. In a recent article for Human Studies, Luna describes a specific experience that she terms explicit chronic shame, which I think is really useful for understanding how loneliness reproduces itself over time, becoming increasingly resistant to outside interference. Luna's conceptualization of chronic shame suggests that, in her words, the horizons of one's present experience come to be dominated by the possibility of shame. It feels as though shame is constantly just around the corner. When every remedy for loneliness seems to pivot on some form of social contact or connection, at the same time as the systemic shaming of loneliness as a matter of personal failure explicitly undermines confidence in our ability to successfully navigate social situations, the anticipation of further shame can trigger powerful defensive strategies. We can see these at play, for example, in the exaggerated excuses of Evelyn Holmes' archetypal and fictional lonely person who protested, "Do not tell me to get in touch with my family, join a club, do social work, because I abhor hospitals, dirt, and doing good." This is a very long and persistent problem, framing how lonely people interact or don't interact with services, community resources, and estranged or distanced friends and relations. Closer attention to the shame of loneliness and the loneliness of shame, as well as the experiences and histories which tangle them together, I think has vast potential to transform and energize our understandings of both. Thank you.
For that really rich and interesting paper. Would you stop sharing your slides, because then we can see everyone who's in the Zoom call.
I think so.
And then it'll be easier. What I'll do is alternate questions between the room and online. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand very quick. No, go ahead.
So thank you so much. This is a fascinating talk, and I especially liked the sort of the deep engagement with this archive of these sort of accounts of the lonely person that sort of emphasizes how there's a reason why they would be lonely, right? And I think that there's many. I mean, obviously, the story you're telling, it has a particular starting point. It's kind of focused on the UK, you know, and why not, right? And I can think in some ways, right, about how the figure of the lonely person historically has been unsettling in many ways, right? I mean, some people would draw associations with witchcraft accusations, and I mean, I don't want to kind of like, emphasize that too much. A more amusing version of this that comes up is if you're familiar with the Peace Corps, which is this American development initiative where they send, you know, 20-somethings like myself out to sort of help people in developing countries, right? There's this sort of very common phenomenon where the Peace Corps volunteer shows up and they're very annoyed that they're assigned an official friend and they don't want this friend, right? The village thinks that they have to kind of, their obligation to the person, they have to make sure that you're not alone. And then there's this actually part of training where they basically try to tell you how to deal with this person who wants to be your friend. And this is worldwide, by the way, right? So there's something I think weird about modern Anglo-American ideas about personal boundaries, right? That maybe your research is actually getting at in very interesting ways. And if you put it in a more global context, there's some sort of incitement to discourse about the figure of the lonely person in this particular time period that I think you're really onto something. And I was just wondering if maybe you could kind of zoom out a little bit and think about, you know, sort of what is being renegotiated here in this kind of emergent public sphere that might have been negotiated privately, and maybe you wouldn't have an archive to address that in the same way, but also maybe that there's something about even the whole world of public media and also stranger sociality that this is all tracking with, that your research is kind of getting at.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really interesting. I don't really know how to answer it.
It's a great comment.
Yeah, I think there's really something that, like, obviously kind of loneliness is this, like, is being talked about in different ways for hundreds and hundreds of years and in all kinds of different places. But there's this kind of urge to systematize and to almost classify, I think, and to try and work out and establish and also to flesh out what loneliness is and how it works. That brings all of these different things into tension across the course of the 20th century. And so in the UK context, that takes the form in some of the things I've explored of people trying to understand who becomes lonely and why, but also like what these kind of hidden messages are about loneliness and what loneliness really tells us about someone. That in some ways then is like sitting on this sill of like folk knowledge and assumptions. And yeah, I mean, obviously I'm not the kind of historian who could draw a line from witches straight to the kind of things that I'm talking about, but it's there, right? Like that kind of preoccupation with misfits, the people who are kind of outside. I don't know if it helps, but yeah, it's the kind of the global context I always find really interesting. Like when you kind of, because obviously like a lot of the people who write about the UK, particularly in you know early mid 20th century, they're always chucking in these like proverbs and kind of thoughts from across the world, which are kind of supposed to kind of behoove a certain wisdom and carry this kind of folkloric thing to them. So there's this kind of really interesting, like, so that they then kind of get tangled up in how, you know, you have like psychiatrists reproducing these ideas about like eating alone in, you know, different cultures and how that's synonymous with like ogreishness and perhaps the practice of magic and things like that in really, really interesting ways. And there's all kind of like interesting proverbs in Russian, like about like, you know, the I can't remember what it was, but like, you know, it's the cold man who eats alone, or the kind of, you know, this sort of thing, that then is kind of drawn out by a particular kind of Western psychiatrist who's interested in anthropology as well, to tell you something about that. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if that's me.
Kate Ellis has a question in the chat, which you might be able to see yourself, but she writes, the recent flattening of the lonely experience, ignoring the inequalities, is interesting. Are there any thoughts around whether this leveling meant that interventions like COVID support bubbles perpetuated loneliness rather than resolved it in marginalized groups?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely like, I need to draw a distinction between like the way kind of a lot of people, for example, in the academy and talk about loneliness, which actually does have all of these kind of like political nuances still there. But that like, a lot of the kind of public ground has been ceded over to this kind of like, you know, Joe Cox Foundation, big day out kind of like, everyone can feel lonely. Why not like have a, you know, have lots of tables in your town square kind of thing. And it's quite homogenizing. And yeah, I do think it does directly take attention away from how and why lots of people actually do become lonely. And in COVID, there is like a real lack of imagination on the part of people who are coming up with these policies in terms of like what people's lives actually look like and how they might be messy and how, but I mean, essentially all of the kind of, like a vast amount of the public health stuff, and a lot of the things that revolve around like imaginings of home or imaginings of how people interrelate are imagining like, you know, a white, straight nuclear family like in a nice house with a garden basically, and there's like really a huge amount of the harms in COVID came from just an inability to like think further than that. So yeah, in terms of like, yeah, bubbles, you know, even things like distancing, you know, kind of how many people you can have in your house, all of these things are kind of, you know, completely entangled with that particular homogenized imagining of what people are like, which doesn't track across the UK, let alone anywhere else.
Stuart, did you have a question?
Thank you. Yes. First of all, I'd like to echo the thank for a really thought-provoking and engaging talk. And it was nice to have like the sprinkles of personality, the description of Suter drunk on the spiciness of his own hot take. I think that was an amazing description that I'm going to squirrel away from myself. But I was really drawn to the distinction between sort of the problematic distinction between the deserving lonely and the sort of like those which have it thrust upon them, as you described, and just to sort of continually bring it up to sort of the present moment as the COVID question. It's not my area of expertise, but I was wondering if you'd had any thought, and maybe it engages with Luna's idea of chronic shame, sort of loneliness-based or grounded communities that we see, particularly online communities, sort of ones that see it as a source of shame, ones that don't, by which I mean incels, so involuntary celibate, both very problematic, as sort of ones that take it on as maybe a source of shame, the loneliness, but nevertheless stick together through that loneliness, or what you might think of the equally problematic sort of sigma or delta mindset, sort of, I don't know if people are familiar, but it's very problematic, but it's the idea that you have personality types which are sort of alpha or beta, which I'm sure you can draw the inferences for them, but the sigma or delta are those that operate outside of this.
Right. Okay.
Otherwise, so it's sort of, so it's a society, it's a community grounded in loneliness, but without the shame. I'm just wondering where those two examples fitted into this sort of distinction.
Yeah. I can speak to incels, I think, because I don't know too much about the sigma delta one, unfortunately. Sorry. Yeah, it's interesting because I'm on loneliness Twitter, and it's only like 1 or 2 clicks away from incel Twitter, which can occasionally be like, you know, like you click something, you're like, oh, okay, no, this is the wrong kind of loneliness. Yeah, it's interesting because like incels have actually quite a like a relatively well-developed, like kind of structural causative story for why they feel the way they do. So actually, they're not like, I mean, there are like patterns, I think, of like self-recrimination and kind of identity and self-loathing and things going on there that make it a lot more troublesome than, say, for example, like, I mean, I don't know if these exist, but like a group of people who are like, we're being isolated by the, you know, the fact that everything is completely hostile to, you know, fellow feeling amongst people, and let's do something about that, which I would think of being like a really nice thing. But they have like an advanced and complex structural critique of society and why they're lonely. It's just that critique is women don't want to sleep with us. And there's not really yeah, so I find it incredibly interesting because shame isn't there. I mean, I think shame is there, but shame isn't there in like in the way that say you're like a young man who feels deeply lonely but hasn't but hasn't kind of interacted with that kind of online space, for example. And in some ways, I think like the removal of shame, or like the deferral of shame, or the kind of pushing of shame down into something else is probably one of the things that's really attractive about that kind of subculture.
Yeah, as a way of addressing the shame.
Yeah. Interestingly, I don't actually have it here, and I wish I had it to hand. But in some ways, it's like I haven't really done a history of this, but I found a newspaper story from like the 1940s that was like. Lonely man demands that the mayor of Hartlepool find him a wife, and it's kind of actually like it's not like a million miles away from. I mean, I got the feeling that this was just like a kind of fairly confused guy who was like, well, I'm lonely, I'll write to the mayor. But like, there's it's quite interesting. Like I think I've had some quite interesting conversations with people who work specifically on loneliness and incels, and sometimes they go a little bit too native for my liking, but like the idea that loneliness is like, I don't know, it's really difficult. Like how, like there's a genuine question of how do you take suffering seriously, which is predicated on something which you think is like weird or horrible, is like a genuine challenge. And I mean, I suppose you kind of care about the suffering, but then don't agree with. But then I mean, men's rights activism, stuff around like loneliness, suicide, depression is actually in some ways like you can see why it can be so super convincing, because it is like it's taking something that like is like actually a real problem, and then completely misdiagnosing like why, particularly in the kind of assumption that what's needed is less feminism rather than more. But yeah, anyway, I think it's like an older thing. But somehow these like even quite scholarly and supposedly critical takes on incels and loneliness never quite get at how lonely women feel, that there are these groups of people like, and how alienating that can be, knowing that there are these kind of like weird guys out there who see you as like property. Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll go, there's another question in the chat. So we'll go
We
back
have
to
any
the-
incels in the room?
So Tom Wood has written, thank you for the brilliant talk. I'm a researcher on the history of asexuality, and I was fascinated on how what you were discussing really seems to mirror my own research. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on or came across the connection between shame, loneliness, and lack of sexual attraction. So how asexuality or lack of life partners has been framed in terms of shame and loneliness.
Oh, that's huge. That's so interesting. I'd love, if you're there, Tom, I'd love to know more about your work. No, I haven't come across much about that. I can imagine how that's worked. I mean, I know there's lots of even kind of like suspicion and shame around asexual people from within the big broad LGBTQIA umbrella, and kind of, and obviously also asexual people don't always feel like they should sit in there as well. Yeah, I can see that completely. I don't know much about it, I'm sorry to say, but I'd love to hear more about your work sometime.
Okay, back to the room. Yes.
Oh, I really enjoyed that. And obviously I'm not speaking from the right period at all, but I wondered if, when people are talking about loneliness in your sources across the 20th century, do they mean the same thing? Are they perhaps admitting to something that is less shameful than what they're really feeling? So is outing yourself as lonely better than saying I'm chronically depressed? So what's the kind of, is there an iceberg of other things going on?
That's a really interesting question. I think like there's maybe not quite depression, because that relationship's like a bit more vexed sometimes. There's a really interesting, I think, and it's something I really want to write about in the future if I can. There's a really interesting like shift from like kind of 1930s onwards. So when you kind of first have people writing about loneliness in the way that like Gregory Zilborg did, and this kind of it really starts to emerge as like a kind of an object of anxiety, amongst, kind of, medical people, sociologists, etc. But there's a really interesting, I think, like if you take the kind of start of that process, you have people like Harry Stack Sullivan, kind of famous psychiatrist, talking about how no one admits to loneliness and how it always goes underground and it always comes out in all of these different other ways. And then if you kind of fast forward to like the end of the 20th century, people, I think, talk about loneliness when they probably should be talking about other things. And we're much more encouraged to think of our like distress, unhappiness, unease as loneliness, even when it might not necessarily be in the strictest sense of the word. So that kind of history of how loneliness has emerged is like, on one level, a history of untangling loneliness from other similar things. So there's lots of work. I mean, the Frieda von Reichmann article that I briefly discussed gives quite a lot of time to trying to understand what the difference is between loneliness and social anxiety. When previously, I mean, it's kind of unimaginable to us now that those things were like routinely conflated, but von Reichmann says that they were. So yeah, I don't know about masking shame by admitting to one thing. That's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think the sources that I look at are much more used to thinking about problems which we push down and then which crop up in like alarming other ways. So lots of stuff around like psychosomatic problems in post-war Britain are seen as like submerged problems of neurosis that then kind of come up in like, aches, pains, and all these other things. But depression has like a super weird relationship with loneliness, because like at the start of 20th century, I mean, depression isn't like a big word that people are using quite yet, but there's so much confusion and kind of inability or sometimes even unwillingness to like draw a distinction between them. And they can overlap like so much. Like if you look at some of the loneliness scales, some of the depression scales, some of, you can walk into a GP and you can tell them how you feel and they might say you're depressed or they might say you're lonely. And that can depend on only a few different things. So the kind of slippage between those things and the history of firming them up as separate kind of problems that can then be in dialogue is like a really interesting one. Did that answer anything?
Yeah, just like then,
Yeah.
are you measuring the same thing?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the time, I mean, there are like psychologists in, there's, I can't remember his name, there's a psychologist in, I think it was like early 1970s, who was just like, we can't tell the difference between these two things, no one can. Like, but actually like you can, because you can tell the difference between like fleeting experiences of loneliness and like depression. But can you tell the difference between like chronic loneliness and depression? Not necessarily, because they all have like the same kind of feelings of like worthlessness, hopelessness, emptiness, all bound in. So it's like an active construction, right? Like people are, these feelings don't necessarily exist, but they've been made and then they exist because people identify with them. Yeah.
So Tom says he's here and he asked for your email, so I put it in the chat.
Oh, thank
He's
you.
going to email you. So I'm going to move back online and then I'll come to you, Kat. So Oliver Garrett writes, is there any space in your analysis for the literary tradition, not only in Europe either, that lauds or romanticizes aloofness or alienation? I think in particular certain romantic authors or poets, or the hikikomori phenomenon in Japan.
There is space for it, in that my scholarship is capacious, but it has not hitherto been a big part of what I've read or written about. But I'd be really interested in looking into those things. Such a cop out. I'm really sorry, but yeah, I don't know anything about it. But
Yeah, it feels like there's like a lauding, like romanticizing the lonely figure seems like the opposite to shaming and denigrating them. So yeah, anyway, that just.
Well, I think that's an interesting thing, and there always has been, like, you can see that at work in quite a lot of different places. But it then kind of comes into the question of like what kinds of loneliness are romanticized and who gets to be lonely, or who gets to experience solitude in ways that are healthy and good and romantic, and who gets to experience it in ways which are like bad and a problem, that all come out, I think, really, really inflected with class, and questions of like who has the capacity to be alone, which follow these really kind of power inflected lines. So I think maybe that's part of it.
Yeah. Cash?
Yeah, I guess I'm just circling back now a little bit to the questions on asexuality and incels. I was just
Thanks.
I was just struck then by how the shame of loneliness seems to follow people around even when they don't experience themselves as lonely. Right, so given that Tom and Joel distinguish between loneliness and solitude, between like when you long for the absence of social good versus when you're quite happy being by yourself, right? And how asexual people who might well not be lonely, but find community in ways that aren't dependent on sexual romantic relationships or just be like quite enjoying their own company, are often still affected by the shame and the stigma of loneliness. And sort of how that kind of follows you around, whether or not you were experiencing this is obviously be worse if you're actually lonely. And then sort of conversely, how this interpretation of loneliness as sort of your own personal failure that you were describing is such an undercurrent that it seems to me that what we're seeing, for example, with incels is this need to find another explanation, right? Because if you don't find an explanation, you're just stuck with that, right? You're just like stuck with this, oh, this is my fault for like being a bad person, which seems somehow less bearable, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really interesting in terms of how shame can be like sticky and how it doesn't actually have to correspond to anything that's real, and how it doesn't have to even correspond to anything that you're like ashamed of yourself. So it's kind of then becomes like, obviously shame's about how you feel, but it's also about how you feel others feel about you. I don't know if this is too weird an aside, but I got like a free dinner once. And like I was at a conference in like a city and I didn't really know anyone, and I like went out for dinner in this chain. And they kind of like wrote off the bill and said, yeah, don't worry about it. And like when I got home, I was quite embarrassed because I realized that I'd been like sat there on my own reading a book with like loneliness written on it. And like someone had just been like, oh, that poor guy. So like there's, yeah, it doesn't have to be true, I don't think. To mean that people can shame you for it, and that can be something that you really do feel the effects of, even though it doesn't actually map onto your experience at all. Yeah,
it's odd because it reveals something about how not just how we expect people to be sort of these like self-controlled, independent people who who don't get subsumed by loneliness, but also how we certain expectations we have around how we interact with others and how you should be in community. Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, it's really interesting. I was reading a book a little while ago, and it was a really good book called Amatka by an author called Karen Tidbeck, and it's kind of it's sort of Swedish dystopia thing, and it was really good. And I didn't expect there to be something like of professional interest to me in it. But there's this kind of really striking passage where like all of the kind of the norms unravel and people start talking about how lonely they are. And it's like, it's almost as if they failed the kind of the community by feeling that way, and that they have this kind of duty to be that kind of connected citizen, that actually places this kind of huge burden on people, whether they actually feel lonely or whether they just want to be left alone, which I think is completely reasonable. Is that okay? Yeah.
There's a comment in the chat from Helen Goodman. Thank you for a really fascinating paper, Fred. This isn't a question, but on the subject of women's loneliness, I wonder whether you have thought about or might think about maternal loneliness. Women often find the first few weeks or months of motherhood very lonely and isolating. This was especially a big problem during the pandemic. I think it might be exacerbated by the expectation of how things will be once their child is born. expectant mothers expect sleepless nights because of the crying, for instance, but aren't warned about the loneliness they might experience if they land up being almost housebound. It's a comment.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Actually, a lot of the way like knowledge about loneliness was assembled across the 20th century was in relation to mums, kind of like trying to understand how and like what kinds of form of like company children are, and contrasting the experiences of women who are like at home with children with the kind of the men who then go out to work, and actually as one of the kind of, in some ways, anxieties over the loneliness of mothers is one of the kind of big underpinnings of like modern feminism, really. Like it's this huge post-war thing that then kind of, you know, gets translated into stuff like the feminine mystique in 1960s. And yeah, loneliness becomes this big like political battleground in terms of like what it tells us about how you know, a particular set of gendered social relations is kind of inscribing itself on people's like minds and bodies, right? Like, so yeah, it kind of becomes this huge thing, and I think it was massive during the pandemic. Yeah, I kind of me and my partner were lucky enough to have our kid like towards the end, when it was a lot, or like not towards the end because it's not over, sorry, but like as things were, like you know, we could go to mother and baby classes and things like that and try and kind of counteract some of that stuff, but I think it must have just been absolutely horrible for a lot of people, even more so than usual. Thank you for your comment.
Hi, I'm Eva, and thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I'm just wondering about the gender differences, and do you think that the treatment of loneliness and shame in males is different to females, and how is that displayed, and how does society react differently depending on if it's a woman or a man?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, to be honest. I mean, there's quite a lot of literatures on how men and women feel shame differently, I think. In terms of women being more, far more like routinely shamed for all kinds of different things. And so in some ways can be more like susceptible to facets of shame in different ways. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not entirely sure, because there are all kinds of, you know, you can factor in all sorts of things about how, which are sometimes stereotypes, which sometimes not, about kind of how different people are able to talk about, you know, emotions and feelings, which I think is structured with shame and with like how people are supposed to feel. Sorry, that's a really bad answer, but yeah, no, it's a great question. Something I'd like to know more about.
Great. Are there any other questions online or in the room, or comments?
Quick book recommendation for the person who is asking about pregnancy and loneliness by Robbie Davis Floyd, called Birth as American Rite of Passage, where she argues that birth is a ritual, but there's separation and liminality, but without reintegration. Remember, that's a big reason why she argues that postpartum depression is such a problem in a sort of an alienated, individualized society.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
Okay, a comment from Gemma Doyle. Being in Plymouth, there are various things happening in response to the tragic events in Keyham, including a Belong program to research and understand social isolation alongside many other things might be of interest.
Oh yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gemma.
Just a quick one. You mentioned you were interested in the distinction between loneliness and lonesomeness. Could you expand a bit on that? Just because lonesomeness makes me think like a country's.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess I'm just interested in, because I think loneliness has become like such a big idea that we use all the time now to sort of like map out this this like hinterland to like more formal psychiatric diagnosis. And so I'm always really interested when people like slip slightly away from loneliness, when they use like proximal words, but ones which have like slightly different meanings. And I think that kind of like the ways of thinking about loneliness broadly described, which don't actually use the word, can be really, really interesting. I mean, not always, because there was once some person wrote something, sorry if you're here, but it was very silly, so about, they called it like alone salation or something, and you're just like, oh, just don't even try. But I'm really interested in those like different forms of naming. So I think that's what attracts me to histories, because there are different ways of talking about this stuff in the past, but also to like different ways of thinking about loneliness across different cultures, because you have like the word for loneliness doesn't always mean loneliness dead on, you know what I mean? And there's all of these different connotations and things. And I think those are always really useful for thinking about loneliness here and what it means, and how that isn't necessarily inevitable, but might have looked a different way if things had gone differently. Yeah, so always interested in the kind of alternatives, I suppose.
Yes, and just a quick question. I guess as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that what you're talking about is that loneliness is seen as shameful or experienced as shameful. But it's a kind of a bit of a chicken and egg thing. So actually, shame can also drive loneliness or even initiate loneliness, I guess, in the first instance. I sort of feel like there are obviously people for whom they've always been lonely, always had that sense of loneliness, and they may feel that chronic sense of shame, but there may just be also single episodes that cause people to feel lonely within whatever environment or social group they're sitting in. Wouldn't that be? I don't think that's a question, it's just an observation. I think I'm just interested in the loop kind of.
No, yeah, you're right. I think, and I kind of got there a little towards the end of the talk, in that I think that loneliness and shame need to be studied alongside each other in like a massive depth, basically. This in terms of like loneliness being directly or indirectly shamed in narratives about it, is like one of about 1 million different facets to the relationship between loneliness and shame. I mean, it's one I think is important, but it's also completely cyclical and embedded and entangled, that there's so much to do, and I'm interested in pretty much every aspect of that, I think. So yeah, you're right, is what I'm trying to say, and I find that really interesting too.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines, because like Donald Nathanson, who devised that compass of shame, where it's like the 4 common ways people respond to or deal with shame, when bypass or avoid it really, and they go to like attack other, attack self, and compensate or withdraw and avoid. Well, he has withdraw and avoid as 2. So like withdrawing and avoiding means like you're anticipating shameful exposure, you're anticipating judgment, negative judgment, like a sort of social anxiety that you might just avoid and withdraw. And that can, so it could just be like chronic shame leads to chronic loneliness. It could be, really simple causal relationship, but then it can also go the other way around. Loneliness can lead to self-consciousness and a fear of judgment. So yeah, they're so intertwined. Parsing them out would be so tricky.
And shame in a lot of ways, I think, revolves around like when you pare it back, which isn't always desirable to do because it's such a rich and exciting idea. But within shame, I think there is a kernel of like the fear of loneliness. Like it's the ostracism, the isolation that is like the abandonment that is the kind of end point of shame in some ways, I think.
Yeah, that's what the social theorists like. Fear of losing social bonds, the fear of rejection, ostracization, or that's the evolutionary account of why we developed the capacity for shame, is to stay in the herd. The fear of losing social and physical survival is what evolutionarily, if you want to go on talk in that register, is why we evolved shame, and other animals don't have it actually. The capacity for shame. So we are coming up to time. Does anyone have any final comment or question before we? Well, if you just join me in thanking Fred for this very interesting talk and discussion. Thank you.
For asking really, really cool questions.